Thank you. So my name is Jeff Walker, and work with the Texas Water Development Board. While the board does planning and financing for water and wastewater projects around the state, while the board does finance wastewater projects too, I want to more focus on water because that's what we want to talk about. The board was formed in 1958 in response to the drought of the 50s, and hopefully that stays the drought of record. We don't have a new drought of record for this bill. They're charged with creating a state water plan to plan on how to meet needs for water supply in the future, because at that time, in the 50s, there was no planning. There was built a reservoir when we thought they were ready for it. There was no long-term planning, so the state water plan was developed to do 50 years planning. The first water plan was done in 1968, and it was a top-down approach at that time. In fact, some people, if you look at the 1968 water plan, the big project then was it's called the Burley's Ditch. It was to bring a big ditch from Mississippi all the way to the water panhandle, which would be nice to have right now since there's so much water going on in Mississippi and none here. More recently, the 75th legislature enacted Senate Bill 1, which changed the water planning process from a top down to a bottom up process. So all the 16 regional districts, they get together, plan the projects that they need, and that's combined into a statewide plan. Back in the 60s, throughout the 50s and 60s, the big water projects became reservoirs. In fact, there were several reservoirs built in the 60s and 70s in this area. White River Reservoir, Lake Palo Pinto, Greenbelt, Millers Creek, McKenzie, Lake Ballinger, and Palo Duro were all built with water development board financing. What happened at then, though, is a lot of big water projects stalled from different reasons, from economics, the regulations changed, environmental regulations changed, and the problem with a big water project is that you're building it big enough to meet future needs. So that means the immediate people have to pay for those future needs, and that becomes a difficult issue. Recognizing that issue, that we still need to build these big projects for future needs, the legislature in 2007, actually in 2001, they authorized or legislated the Water Infrastructure Fund. It's a fund to implement state water plan projects. You got this big plan, a lot of plans still on the shelf, could be. Well, there's projects in that plan that need to be implemented to meet water needs. So legislature recognized that need, so they developed an infrastructure plan. In 2001, it was enacted. In 2007, they actually funded it. Over the biennium for 2008 and 9 and 10 and 11, they authorized the Water Development Board to issue over $1.2 billion in bonds or to fund water plan projects. And to date, we've committed over $1 billion to water plan projects through those dedicated water plan funding projects. About $750 million in the first biennium, about $500 million in the next biennium, and then we met this legislative session. Water needs still there. In fact, I think the most recent water plans, there's $50 billion in water supply needs in the next 50 years. But as the representative said, this was a tough session. We didn't think we were going to get anything for water plan funding, but we actually got $100 million this next biennium, which is not the $1.2 billion, but it's at least we didn't get nothing. Some of the projects that have been funded for these programs, some pretty neat projects. We've got the wetland reuse projects in the Dallas area, where they're taking their effluent, running it through wetlands, going to clean it, put it in the reservoirs, and then pump it back out. We've got planning of new reservoirs, first time in a long time. Lake Ralph Hall, up in the Metroplex area, Lake Columbia in East Texas, and Bogart, Lake Palo Pinto over in Earl Wells area. In the West Texas region, we've got some really exciting projects that we funded. Lubbock has a pipeline, Lake Allen Henry. The Water Development Board helped fund that. Amarillo is developing a new well field. Water Development Board funded $86 million for that project. Colorado River Municipal Water District is developing a new well field out in Ward County. And we also helped fund the Big Spring Reclamation Project you may have heard about, where they're using their effluent to become treated water. And then locally here, we've got the City of Eden has some problems with the radionuclides in their wells and lack of water. We funded that project. And then we're about to close, I think, next week. The City of San Angelo is a $120 million project to bring hickory water to the City of San Angelo to help meet their needs. So those are big water projects that the legislature has helped us do. We've gone a long way. We've come a long way in the last few years. There's still a lot of projects left to do. One thing I want to let y'all know about these are state general obligation bonds that we fund. They're self-supporting. That means we loan them out to the communities pay them back, and we pay off the state bonds. However, this proposition, we're about out of GO authority. And so the legislature proposed Proposition 2 on the next, in November, to give us more authority to issue those bonds. So there's a lot of information about that on our website, so I would welcome y'all to go look at that information. And that's all I got right now. Let's see if there's any questions.
Thank you. I'm Larry Gilley, City Manager of Abilene, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today and talk about an issue that I know is important to everybody in this room. Particularly this year, we've seen drought conditions throughout the big country, and a long-term sustainable water supply is something that we all are interested in, and we're going to talk a little bit today about that cooperative arrangement that the cities of Abilene, Midland, and San Angelo have entered into to plan for the long-term future of our water supplies, not only in our communities, but in communities throughout the big country. I want to begin by talking about how we're handling our water supply issues on the short term in Abilene right now. Obviously, water use, because of the drought conditions and the extended period of very high temperatures, we're seeing a lot more use for landscape irrigation, and so we have measures in place to monitor and curtail the use of water for that purpose, and have had for many, many years in Abilene. And fortunately, our community has embraced that concept. We still have to monitor it. We still have individuals who violate the requirements of our conservation measures periodically, but overall, that has had a big impact for many years on our ability to reduce and conserve the amount of water that we use. In fact, historically, we have reduced our annual average consumption by literally millions of gallons per day based on the efforts that we have made through our conservation program. Right now, we're in stage 1 of our conservation. We have year-round conservation measures, regardless of the weather conditions and the lake levels. But right now we're in stage 1, which allows landscape watering only twice per week for our residential customers. Another thing that we've done that has made a significant difference in the amount of potable water that we produce and use on a daily basis is we have an extensive reuse system. We use our treated effluent throughout the community for landscape irrigation. We have some major customers, Dice Air Force Base, our local universities, our golf courses. Those are typical reuse irrigation customers, and on average annual basis, we pump about 4 million gallons a day through that reuse system. Now, as you can imagine, we have an available supply of almost 12 million gallons a day, and right now we are using as much of our treated effluent for our landscape irrigators as we possibly can. That is a significant amount of water to reduce the amount of water required from our potable system. But I want to talk about also very briefly one of our long-term solutions. Obviously, for any city, and certainly cities in West Texas, we know that in order to continue to grow and prosper, we have to have a sustainable water supply for the future. In Abilene, we have been moving forward for a number of years now to develop a new reservoir, something that has not been done in a very long time in Texas. But we believe that the time is right, and we believe for the future of our communities and perhaps other communities around us, we really need to be pressing forward with the development of a new reservoir. We have, just last week, the City Council authorized the filing of a water rights permit application with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. We are moving forward with that process. Now, as you know, that is the very early stages of the process. It'll be likely a number of years before we would be granted that permit, and certainly beyond that before we would look at actually construction of the reservoir. As I've heard Mayor Archibald say many, many times, this is a marathon, not a sprint. But we are committed to it. We believe that it's in the long term going to be very beneficial for our community. Just a few quick facts. The proposed reservoir is located on the Clear Fork of the Brazos River. Most of the conservation pool will be located in Shackelford County. It is on the site of what is now known as the Henry Ranch, the Henry Home for Children Ranch, about 35 miles north of Abilene. It's the profile of the reservoir is interesting because it is a narrow canyon area, about 6,600 acres in surface coverage, but it would be a reservoir that would be on average about 35 feet deep, at its deepest point about 130 feet deep. So it's a nice profile for a reservoir that it would minimize the effect of evaporation. So we're looking forward to moving forward on that project. It would contain about available water supply of about 34 to 35,000 acre feet per year. The first step, as I said, was to file the water rights application with the TCEQ. Next spring to early summer, we're probably going to move forward with filing an application with the U.S. Corps of Engineers for a 404 permit. That would be the permit that would actually allow for the construction of the reservoir. And as we move forward, right now, this is entirely a City of Abilene project. But as you'll hear further in just a few minutes from my colleagues, we're certainly looking at partnerships that could include the Cedar Ridge Reservoir, and those partnerships would not be limited to just the three cities that are currently working together on future water supplies. We would be very open to having conversations with any city in the big country that has an interest in this reservoir. So in a nutshell, that's where we are today. We're going to leave for a few minutes for questions and answers, and I'll be happy to cover more about the reservoir project or any other topics that you'd like to know about at that point.
Thanks, Larry. Again, Courtney Sharp, City Manager of Midland, and when I go out and visit with the Midland folks, the new motto of Midland is "Brown is the new green." We are in stage 2 of our water conservation plan. And let me give you a little bit of history on Midland and its water. We have two water sources. We get water from the CRNWD, which you all know is primarily the surface with the lakes. We also have a well field, which is called the Paul Davis well field. It's about 30 miles north of Midland. It has about 35 wells. One of the issues on that with you all were faced with some grass fires over this past spring. We were too, and it took out a lot of our, I think 7 or 8 of our wells out of that well field that was tied to the SCADA system. So we're scrambling, trying to get those wells back in line to get the electricity and the computer programs working again so we can start pumping that Paul Davis. One of the issues with the Paul Davis well field is 5 years ago, or maybe 5 or 6 years ago, EPA lowered the arsenic limits on what parts per billion of arsenic that could go into the water. It was at 50, they reduced it to 5, and we're at about 42 parts per billion. So we are limited on how much we can pump out of the Paul Davis well field, and we have to blend it with the CRNW to get under those limits. So we do have that alternative source of the Paul Davis well fields, but we are limited as to how much we can use.